They wanted to make an example out of him, to prove that even legends could fall if they dared to say what the right people didn't want to hear. But Clint wasn't the kind of man to bow his head. He just stared at them like kids playing pretend in a courtroom, and then he said one sentence that turned everything upside down. That's when the real chaos began. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine walking into a courtroom where everything already smells rigged, like stepping onto a casino floor where the dealer is grinning because he already knows you're about to lose. Cameras everywhere, reporters whispering. A jury that looks so hand-picked, they might as well be wearing t-shirts that say guilty until proven left wing. And at the center of it all, Clint Eastwood. Yeah, that Clint Eastwood. The man, the legend, the guy who practically invented tough as nails, justice on the big screen. Sitting there like some washed-up criminal, as if decades of playing cowboys and detectives suddenly made him a threat to national security. You could hear a pin drop. No one wanted to be the first to break the tension, except for Judge Eleanor Trask, a career bureaucrat who had spent her whole life climbing the legal ladder just to sit in that chair and pretend she was handing out real justice. She pushed up her glasses with a smirk that screamed, "I've already made up my mind, but let's go through the motions anyway." She cleared her throat, pretending to sound neutral. "Mr. Eastwood, do you understand the charges against you?" Clint didn't move, didn't fidget. He just stared at her, that Eastwood squint, the same look that made outlaws in old westerns rethink every decision they had ever made. His crime? Telling the truth in a world where the truth had become illegal. Apparently, words were now as dangerous as bullets, and Clint had been pulling the trigger way too much for some people's liking. The prosecutor, Carter Whitmore, a smug, Harvard-educated lawyer who looked like he had never touched anything rougher than a laptop keyboard, leaned forward. He had the kind of face that made you wonder if he had ever gotten his hands dirty a day in his life, and the way he smirked, you could tell he thought he was about to take down a giant. "So, Mr. Eastwood," Whitmore began, puffing up like a peacock that had just won a debate club trophy, "your comments regarding traditional masculinity, patriotism, and self-reliance have been deemed inflammatory. The public reaction to your words has led to radicalization among certain groups. Do you deny that you have incited unrest?" Clint sighed, leaning back in his chair like he had just heard the dumbest thing imaginable. "All I ever told people was to stand up for themselves." Judge Trask's lips twitched. "So you admit that your rhetoric is divisive?" That was it. The setup was too obvious. This wasn't about law. It wasn't even about right or wrong. It was about power, about shutting up people who refused to play along. Clint exhaled slowly, his voice low and deliberate. "Lady, if telling people to be strong is a crime, you better lock up every grandfather in America." Boom! The courtroom erupted. Laughter, applause, shocked whispers. Even a couple of the jury members looked like they were trying not to smirk. But Judge Trask? She lost it. Her gavel came down like she was trying to crack the desk in half. "Silence! If I hear another outburst, I will hold this entire room in contempt." "Ah, yes. The I don't like what you're saying, so I'll just threaten everyone approach." Classic. Clint? He didn't move, didn't react. He just sat there like a man who had seen it all before and wasn't the least bit surprised. The media cameras zoomed in, already crafting the headlines. The jury shifted uncomfortably, like they had just realized this wasn't going to be as easy as they thought. The fix was in, and everyone knew it. The verdict had been written before the trial even started, but if they thought Clint was just going to sit there and take it, they clearly had no idea who they were dealing with. If there was ever a courtroom performance worthy of an award for worst acting, this was it. The prosecution wasn't just grasping at straws. They were straight up building a house of nonsense and hoping no one noticed it was made out of paper. They rolled out every so-called expert they could find, professors, journalists, online safety specialists. Basically, a parade of people who had never built anything, never fought for anything, and never worked a real job outside of sipping overpriced coffee and typing think pieces about how the world is unfair to them personally. But sure, let's all listen to what they had to say about how Clint Eastwood was somehow the root of all evil. The lead prosecutor, Carter Whitmore, sat there like he was about to deliver the closing argument in the trial of the century. He was a 35-year-old trust fund kid with a law degree that probably cost more than most people's houses, soft hands that had never touched a callus, and the confidence of someone who had never actually been told no in his entire life. Whitmore adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and tried his best serious voice. "Mr. Eastwood, do you deny that your films have inspired real-world violence?" Silence. Clint blinked, then slowly he raised an eyebrow. "So, by your logic," Clint made, voice smooth as ever, "Shakespeare is responsible for every sword fight since the 1600s? Boom! The jury snickered. A couple of them even exchanged looks, like, wait a second, that actually makes sense. Whitmore turned red, like a kid who just realized he forgot to study for the test he thought was going to be easy. Judge Eleanor Trask was not amused. She shot Clint a glare so sharp it could have cut glass. "One more wisecrack, Mr. Eastwood, and I'll hold you in contempt." Translation: "Stop making sense. It's messing up the script." But Clint? He just sat back, completely unfazed, like a guy watching a bad movie, waiting for it to end. Whitmore huffed, flipping through his notes like he was trying to find something that didn't make him look ridiculous. Spoiler alert, there wasn't anything. The prosecution continued its weak performance, throwing out long-winded speeches about how words are weapons and influence is dangerous, all while conveniently ignoring the fact that Hollywood had spent decades glorifying everything they were now accusing Clint of. The jury? They weren't buying it. Then came the real game changer. Enter Jake Marlowe. Just when it seemed like the trial was going to be one long, one-sided lecture, the doors swung open, and in walked Jake Marlowe. No nonsense, sharp suit. The kind of guy who looked like he didn't just pass law school, he fought his way through it. Unlike Whitmore, Marlowe wasn't born into the game. He grew up in a rough part of Detroit, put himself through school the hard way, and earned his reputation by tearing apart every prosecutor who thought they had an easy win. The room shifted. Marlowe adjusted his tie, took his time, and looked over the jury like he already knew how this was going to end. Then finally, he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to the biggest sham trial in American history." Silence. The jury leaned in. Even the reporters stopped taking notes. "The prosecution wants you to believe that Clint Eastwood, a 94-year-old man, a veteran, a director, and an actor, is somehow responsible for the downfall of America, the same America he fought for, the same America that loved him for decades. And why? Because he refuses to bow down to the mob." A few jurors nodded. Judge Trask twitched. "Stay on topic, Mr. Marlowe." Marlowe smirked. "Oh, I am, Your Honor. In fact, I'm just getting started." And in that moment, you could feel the whole courtroom shift. This trial wasn't going to go the way they had planned. Not anymore. If the prosecution thought they were winning, that illusion shattered in the next hour. Because Marlowe and his team, they tore them apart, and not in the polite, let's exchange legal arguments way. No, this was a full-scale courtroom demolition. The so-called experts, the journalists, professors, online safety specialists, they got wrecked. One by one, Marlowe took them apart like they were badly built furniture from a discount store. "You're an expert in what, exactly?" Marlowe asked one of them, flipping through the guy's resume like it was a joke. "Digital culture studies? What does that even mean?" The so-called specialist stammered, trying to explain how Eastwood's movies had reinforced problematic narratives. Marlowe raised an eyebrow. "Just to be clear, you're saying watching a Clint Eastwood movie makes people violent, but movies where the hero blows up an entire city in the name of justice are totally fine?" Silence. The jury wasn't buying it. Next up, the video evidence. Marlowe's team rolled the footage, news clips, interviews, headlines where media figures had twisted Clint's words so badly they barely resembled what he had actually said. Clips of journalists, cherry-picking sound bites, and painting him as something he never was. A before and after shot of Clint's original statements next to how they were presented on TV. The difference? Night and day. The jury was leaning forward now, eyes locked on the screen. Even some reporters in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Judge Trask looked like she had swallowed something sour. And Whitmore? Oh, he was sweating bullets. The prosecution had spent the entire case painting Clint as a villain, but now the jury was starting to see who the real villains were. Then came the moment no one expected. Marlowe stepped aside. And Clint stood up. No lawyer speak, no prepared statements, no notes, just a man facing his accusers. He walked toward the jury, slow and steady, hands in his pockets, scanning the room like he had all the time in the world. And then he spoke. "Let me tell you something about America," Clint said, voice steady, quiet, but carrying enough weight to command the whole room. "I grew up in a time when men were expected to be strong, not because they wanted to be, but because they had to be. They were expected to protect their families, to stand for something, to work hard, to be responsible, to build something instead of tearing things down." He let that sit for a moment. "Now," Clint continued, his voice dipping lower, like he was talking to the jury personally. "Now, you stand for something, and they call you dangerous. They say you're a threat. They say you're the problem." Dead silence. The jury was hooked. Even the prosecution looked rattled. Then Clint turned, directly to Judge Trask. "You want to punish me for speaking my mind?" He said it like a challenge, like he already knew the answer. "Go ahead, but don't pretend this is about justice." You could hear the air leave the room. Judge Trask froze. Whitmore's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Even the court reporters had stopped typing. And then, the final blow. Clint looked straight ahead, into the cameras, into the jury, into every person in that room who had forgotten what justice actually meant. "Maybe you forgot what country you're in," he said, voice even. "But I haven't." Boom! The room was stunned. No one moved, no one spoke, because at that moment, everyone watching knew the truth. The trial wasn't about what Clint had said. It was about silencing the wrong kind of person. But Clint? He wasn't the type to stay quiet. 6 hours. That was how long it took for the jury to decide the fate of a living legend. And in those 6 hours, America was holding its breath. The news anchors had already run out of things to speculate about. The analysts were throwing out theories, contradicting themselves every 5 minutes just to fill the dead air. Social media? On fire. Some people were convinced Clint Eastwood was about to become the latest victim of a justice system that had started looking more like a PR machine than an actual court of law. Others were hoping, praying, that this was the moment someone finally stood up against the nonsense. And in the middle of it all, Judge Eleanor Trask, sweating bullets. For the first time in the entire trial, she actually looked nervous. Before today, she had been in complete control. She had shut down arguments, dismissed objections, and done everything short of personally delivering the prosecution's closing statement. But now she had no control. Now it was up to the jury. And that terrified her. Whitmore, the once smug prosecutor, wasn't looking too great either. His confidence had disappeared somewhere between Marlowe's opening argument and the moment Clint Eastwood stood up and made the entire courtroom remember what integrity actually looked like. Now, Whitmore just sat there, staring down at his desk like he was trying to mentally prepare for his next career move. Then, finally, the jury returned. The courtroom went silent. Like, completely silent. Not even the usual shuffling of papers or the quiet muttering from the gallery. Just nothing. The jury foreman, an older man who looked like he had spent a lifetime doing actual, honest work, stood up. He had the kind of weathered hands you only get from years of building things, fixing things, doing something that actually matters. He squared his shoulders, took a deep breath, and glanced over at Clint. Not with pity, not with judgment, just respect. Then he turned to Judge Trask, and he spoke. Not guilty. Boom. It was like a bomb went off. The courtroom exploded. Cheering, yelling. People jumping out of their seats, clapping so hard it echoed off the walls. Some were crying, others were laughing, hugging each other, celebrating like they had just witnessed history being made, and in a way, they had. Reporters scrambled to get the first headline out. Some were already screaming into their microphones, trying to get their voices over the noise. Cameramen fought to get the perfect shot of Clint, of the jury, of the chaos. Social media was probably melting down in real time. And Clint? He just nodded, once. No victory speech, no fist pump, no dramatic reaction. Just that quiet, knowing look. Like a man who had already seen how the story was going to end. Like a man who never needed validation from a system that had already shown its cracks. Judge Trask? She looked like she had just swallowed an entire lemon, whole. Her grip on the gavel tightened, her lips pressed together so hard they almost disappeared. Whitmore? He was ashen-faced. His hands clenched into fists on the table, his shoulders stiff. The kind of look someone has when they realize their entire career just got torched on live television. And the media, for the first time in a long time, they had nothing to say. Because they had already written their headlines before the verdict. They had already planned the fall of Clint Eastwood. And now, they had to scrap everything. As Clint walked out of the courtroom, the crowd outside erupted. People waving signs, chanting his name, some just screaming into their phones, telling everyone they knew what had just happened. Security had to clear a path just to let him through. And then, the moment everyone would remember. A swarm of reporters rushed forward, microphones, cameras, a mess of voices all shouting at once. But only one journalist managed to push through, a young guy, probably not much older than Clint's own grandkids, holding a mic like he had just won the lottery. "Mr. Eastwood," he called out, breathless, "what do you have to say to your critics?" Clint paused. He tilted his head slightly, like he was actually considering an answer. Then, he smirked. And, in classic Eastwood fashion, he muttered, "Go ahead. Make my day." Boom! The reporters lost it. Cameras flashed, microphones shoved closer. The media, scrambling to capture the moment that would define this case forever. And just like that, the legend lived on. What would you do in Clint's place? How would you respond if someone tried to silence you just for speaking the truth? Drop your thoughts in the comments, share your experiences, and let us know if you or someone you know has ever faced a similar situation. Hit the like button if you believe justice should always win, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that matter. This story wasn't made to divide, it was made to shine a light on an issue, to show why standing your ground matters, and to remind everyone that the truth deserves to be heard.